channel. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss anatomical nomenclature. The word nomenclature simply means a system of naming. So, when we say anatomical nomenclature, we are talking about the system used to name different structures of the human body. Now, you may think that naming anatomical structures is very simple. For example, we have the femur, tibia, heart, liver, artery, vein, and so on. But historically, anatomical naming was not this simple. There were thousands of anatomical terms, and different anatomists sometimes used different names for the same structure. So, today, let's understand how anatomists gradually develop a more standardized system of anatomical terminology. First, let's understand why so many anatomical terms are based on Greek and Latin. An important physician and anatomist named Galen, who lived in the 2nd century, wrote his works in Greek. Later, during the 16th century, Andreas Vesalius, one of the most important figures in modern anatomy, wrote his famous anatomical work in Latin. Because important anatomical literature was written in Greek and Latin, many anatomical terms that we use even today have Greek or Latin origin. So you can remember it like this: Galen, Greek, and Vesalius, Latin. This is one of the reasons why Greek and Latin became so important in anatomical terminology. Now comes the problem. By the 19th century, approximately 30,000 anatomical terms were being used in books and journals. Imagine this situation. Suppose you are studying one anatomical structure from one book, and that book gives it one name. Then you open another book and the same structure is given another name. Now imagine this happening thousands of times. Obviously, it would create a lot of confusion. Students would become confused. Teacher could use different terminology, and communication between anatomists and doctors could become difficult. Therefore, anatomists realized that there was a need for standardization of anatomical terminology. In simple words, too many terms could lead to confusion, and need for one standardized system is required. Now we come to a very important event. In 1895, the German Anatomical Society held a meeting. At this meeting, they approved a list of approximately 5,000 anatomical terms. This list was called Basel Nomina Anatomica, abbreviated as BNA. Let's understand the name Basel. Basel refers to the place where the meeting was held. Nomina means names, and Anatomica means anatomical. So, BNA was basically a standardized list of anatomical names. This was an important step toward bringing uniformity to anatomical terminology. Now, the BNA established 6 important rules for anatomical terminology. These 6 rules are very important, so let's understand each one carefully. The rule number 1 is each part should have only one name. The first rule was each anatomical part should have only one name. The purpose was to prevent confusion. If one anatomical structure had several different names, students and doctors could become confused. Therefore, the idea was one structure, one standardized name. So, whenever you see this rule, remember one anatomical structure should have one accepted name. The second rule was each anatomical term should be in Latin. Why Latin? Because Latin had already played an important role in medical and scientific literature, and using a common language helped standardize terminology internationally. For example, many anatomical terms that you encounter are Latin based. So remember, anatomical nomenclature is in Latin terminology. The third rule was each term should be as short and simple as possible. Think about it. If an anatomical structure has a very long and complicated name, it becomes difficult to learn and difficult to use repeatedly. Therefore, anatomical terms should be short, simple, and easy to use. The purpose was to make anatomical terminology more practical and easier to remember. Now, this fourth rule may sound a little confusing. It says The terms shall be merely memory signs. What does this mean? It means that an anatomical term should primarily act as an identifying label or name for a structure. The name does not have to explain everything about the structure. For example, when we say femur, the word femur simply identifies a particular bone. The term itself does not need to describe all its functions, attachments, or features. So think of an anatomical term like a label on a diagram. It tells you this is the structure I am talking about. The fifth rule is very useful for understanding anatomy. It says related anatomical terms should be similar. Let's take the example given in your textbook: femoral artery, femoral vein, femoral nerve. Notice something common? The word femoral appears in all three terms. Why? Because these structures are related to the femoral region. So, the terminology itself gives us a clue about their anatomical relationship. Therefore, related structure is similar terminology. This makes anatomical terminology more logical and easier to understand. The sixth rule says adjectives should be arranged as opposites. For example, major, minor, and superior, inferior. These words represent opposite concepts. We can also see the same principle in terms such as anterior, posterior, and medial, lateral. The purpose is to make anatomical terminology systematic. So remember, opposite anatomical relationship means opposite terms. Now, the BNA was not the final system. It was later revised. In 1933, a committee of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain and Ireland revised the BNA. The meeting was held in Birmingham. Therefore, this revised version became known as Birmingham Revision or simply BR. Then, in 1935, another independent revision of the BNA was made by German anatomist. This revision was associated with JENA and was called Jena Nomina Anatomica. It is abbreviated as JNA, and you may also see INA used in this context. So now we have in 1933 Birmingham Revision and in 1935 Jena Nomina Anatomica. However, there was still a problem. Neither the Birmingham Revision nor the Jena Revision received sufficiently broad international acceptance. Their acceptance remained mainly local or restricted. Therefore, anatomists still needed a nomenclature that could be accepted internationally. Now we come to another important step. In 1950, an International Congress of Anatomists was held at Oxford. At this meeting, it was agreed that another attempt should be made to establish a generally acceptable international anatomical nomenclature. In simple words, anatomists wanted to create a system that could be accepted and used internationally. Then, in 1955, the Sixth International Congress of Anatomists was held in Paris. At this meeting, a revised version of the BNA was approved. This revision was relatively conservative. What does conservative means? It means that the previous terminology was not completely discarded. Instead, much of the existing BNA terminology was retained, while many useful terms from the Birmingham revision and Jena revision were also incorporated. So, this was another major step toward developing an internationally anatomical nomenclature continued to be improved. In 1960, at the International Congress of Anatomists in New York, minor revisions and corrections were made. Then in 1965, another international congress was held at Germany where further minor revisions and corrections were made. These were steps toward improving and correcting the terminology. Then, in 1968, the third edition of Nomina Anatomica was published. The editor was G.A.G. Mitchell. This edition was published by the Medica Foundation. For your exams, the most important thing to remember here is in 1968, the third edition of Nomina Anatomica was published. Now, anatomical nomenclature was not limited only to gross anatomy. Terminology was also developed for histology and embryology. Two important systems were prepared, nomina histologica and nomina embryologica. Let's understand these names. Histologica refers to histology, which is the study of tissues. Therefore, nomina histologica means standardized names used in histology. Similarly, embryologica refers to embryology, which deals with the development. Therefore, nomina embryologica is standardized terminology used in the embryology. These drafts were prepared by the subcommittee of the International Anatomical Nomenclature Committee, abbreviated as IANC. Now we come to 1970. The 11th International Congress of Anatomists was held in Leningrad. At this meeting, the drafts of Nomina Histologica and Nomina Embryologica were approved in a plenary session. After further critical revision, the fourth edition of Nomina Anatomica was published in 1977. The editor was Roger Warwick. This fourth edition contained Nomina Anatomica, Nomina Histologica, Nomina Embryologica. So, by this stage, anatomical terminology had become much more organized and standardized. And this brings us to the end of the histological development described in your textbook. So, before we finish, let's revise the entire topic very quickly. Galen wrote in Greek, Vesalius wrote in Latin. Therefore, many anatomical terms have Greek or Latin origin. By the 19th century, around 30,000 anatomical terms were being used. This created confusion and led to the need for standardization. Then, in 1895, BNA, Basal Nomina Anatomica, BNA introduced six important principles. Then, in 1933, Birmingham Revision, and in 1935, Jena Nomina Anatomica, but these had limited international acceptance. Then, in 1950, Oxford International Nomenclature effort was made. In 1955, in Paris, important revision. In 1960, New York minor revisions. In 1965, further corrections were made. In 1968, third edition of Nomina Anatomica. In 1970, Leningrad, Nomina Histologica and Nomina Embryologica approved. And finally, in 1977, fourth edition of Nomina Anatomica. So the overall story is too many anatomical names then leads to confusion, which brings up standardization, international revision, and then organized anatomical nomenclature. And that is the basic history of anatomical nomenclature.